Grease has a way of working itself into the lines of your palms. It stains the skin, weaving into the calluses until your hands look like they belong to a stranger. I stared at my hands under the flicker of the single fluorescent tube, still fighting to stay alive in the shop. It was 2 in the morning. The concrete floor radiated a damp chill that crept up through the soles of my boots and settled deep in my knees. The shop was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet you get after a job well done. It was the heavy silence of a place slowly dying. The air smelled of stale coffee rust and the metallic tang of old motor oil. I wiped a rag across the fender of a rusted-out pickup. The motion was automatic, my mind 100 miles away. On the workbench, weighed down by a cracked spark plug, sat the mail. 3 envelopes with red lettering. Final notice. The bank didn't care about the cold snap that kept customers away. They didn't care that the supply chain made parts too expensive for the neighborhood regulars. They just wanted the numbers on the paper to balance. My numbers hadn't balanced in 8 months. I tossed the rag onto the cart. The sound echoed in the cavernous space, a hollow thud against the cinder block walls. I walked over to the small glass-paneled office in the corner. The space heater inside was the only piece of equipment I made sure never broke down. Through the smudged glass, I watched Maya sleep. She was 7. She was curled up on an old leather waiting room sofa, buried under a pile of heavy winter coats. One small arm hung off the edge, fingers relaxed, oblivious to the weight crushing the man standing outside the door. She breathed in a steady, slow rhythm. I matched my breathing to hers. It was the only thing that kept the panic from tightening my chest. I opened the door just enough to hear the soft rustle of the coats, making sure the heater was still pushing warm air into the room. I closed it gently. It was just the 2 of us. It had been for 4 years. The day her mother packed a single suitcase and got into a waiting cab, she told me I was married to the rust. Maybe she was right. I watched the taillights fade down the wet street that night, holding a 3-year-old Maya. I knew the garage was the only foundation we had left. It belonged to my father. Now I was the one burying it. I walked back to the workbench and picked up a 3/4 wrench. The steel was cold and heavy. It felt real. It was something I could understand, something with a clear purpose. You apply leverage, the bolt turns. You strip the thread, you tap a new one. The rules of mechanics made sense. The rules of the world outside these bay doors didn't. I tightened my grip on the wrench until my knuckles turned white. A man measures his worth by what he can provide. By that metric, I was running on fumes. I had 30 days before the bank locked the bay doors for good. 30 days to find $10,000 just to stall the foreclosure. It was a mountain I couldn't climb, but I couldn't stop walking. The wind rattled the corrugated tin roof. I looked at the schedule board hanging on the wall. Empty. Nothing but a brake job scheduled for Thursday, barely enough to cover the electric bill. I needed a miracle, or I needed to admit defeat. Looking back at the glass office, defeat wasn't on the menu. I poured the dregs of the cold coffee from the pot into a mug. It tasted like battery acid and burnt plastic. I drank it in one long pull, feeling the bitter sting hit the back of my throat. It was fuel. It was all I had. My father built this place with his own 2 hands. He bought the land when it was nothing but dirt and weeds. I remembered being Maya's age, sitting on an overturned bucket, watching him wrestle transmissions out of old muscle cars. He smelled like sweat and cheap aftershave. He made it look easy. He made it look like a man could build a life out of iron and grease. He didn't live to see the neighborhood change. He didn't see the corporate dealerships move in down the highway, driving the independent guys into the ground. He died believing a handshake and a fair price were all you needed to survive. I was learning the hard way that a handshake didn't pay the property tax. I set the mug down and picked up a heavy bastard file. There was a stack of old rotors in the corner waiting to be surfaced. The lathe was broken, the belt snapped 2 days ago. I was going to have to file the edges by hand just to make them safe for the scrapyard. It was busy work. It was a way to keep my hands moving so my mind wouldn't devour itself. The scrape of metal on metal filled the quiet. It was a harsh grinding rhythm. 1 pass, 2 passes. The pile of iron dust grew on the concrete floor. My shoulders burned. My lower back throbbed with a dull ache that I had stopped taking painkillers for months ago. The pain kept me awake. Dawn was still hours away. The streetlights cast long amber shadows through the frosted upper windows of the bay doors. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I imagined what it would be like to just walk away, to lock the doors, take Maya, and drive until the gas tank ran dry. Start over somewhere clean. Somewhere without the smell of exhaust baked into the walls. But I knew I wouldn't. A captain goes down with his ship and a mechanic gets buried under his cars. I blew the iron dust off the rotor, set it aside, and picked up the next one. The file bit into the metal. The sound echoed again. By the time the sky outside began to turn a bruised pale gray, I had finished the stack. My arms felt like lead. I wiped my face with the back of my arm, leaving a streak of black grease across my forehead. The morning traffic started a low rumble on the highway a mile away. I walked to the sink in the corner and turned the tap. The water came out cold and brown for a few seconds before turning clear. I scrubbed my hands with the pumice soap, watching the water turn black and swirl down the drain. It took off the top layer of dirt, but the deep stains remained. They always did. I dried my hands on a paper towel and walked over to the bay door. I grabbed the heavy chain and pulled. The gears groaned, protesting the movement, as the massive metal door slowly rolled up. The cold morning air hit my face, sharp and biting. The street was empty. I stood in the threshold, watching the sun crest over the low-income apartments across the street. The light was weak, filtered through a haze of city smog. It was a new day, a new chance to fight a losing battle. I heard a soft shuffle behind me. I turned to see Maya standing in the doorway of the office, rubbing her eyes with a small fist. She was wearing my old flannel shirt over her pajamas. It draped down past her knees. "Oh, morning, Dad," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Morning, squirt," I said, forcing a tightness out of my throat. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded. "It was warm." She walked over and wrapped her arms around my leg. I looked down at her messy hair, feeling a fierce protective ache in my chest. I put a heavy calloused hand on her head. The shop, the bank, the crushing weight of it all that could wait until the sun was fully up. The flatbed rolled up just after noon. The diesel engine shook the loose panes of glass in my bay doors. I wiped the grease off my hands and stepped out into the harsh midday glare. Sitting on the steel bed of the truck was a ghost. It was a 1964 Aston Martin DB5, painted a deep liquid silver. It looked like it belonged in a museum behind velvet ropes, not sitting in my crumbling driveway. The driver, a kid in a crisp polo shirt, hopped out with a clipboard. He wasn't the owner. He was a transport broker hired by a man who didn't deal with mechanics directly. The paperwork had a signature at the bottom that I didn't bother reading. The broker said it was running rough. A misfire in cylinder 4, likely a sticking valve or a bad seat. He offered me $5,000 in cash, half up front to rebuild the top end by Friday. It was the exact kind of money that could keep the bank at bay. I should have said no. I didn't have the specialized tools for a British inline six of that pedigree. But I looked at the thick envelope of cash in the kid's hand. I saw Maya's face through the office window, and I took the keys. We pushed the heavy silver machine into the center bay. It sat there like a crown jewel in a coal mine. The paint reflected the cracked concrete and the flickering overhead lights. I started the teardown as soon as the sun dipped below the skyline. The air grew cold again. I set up halogen work lights around the fender, bathing the engine bay in a stark, blinding glow. The aluminum engine block was an engineering marvel, intricate and unforgiving. By midnight, my eyes were burning. The lack of sleep from the past week sat on my shoulders like a physical weight. My hands, normally steady, carried a faint tremor. I drained the fluids and removed the twin-cam cylinder head. The parts were laid out on a clean workbench in a precise row. The problem was a burnt exhaust valve. It was a tedious fix, requiring patience and a clear head. I had neither. I just had the ticking clock in my head and the desperate need to finish. I ground the new valve seat, lapped the metal until it mated, and began the reassembly. It was 3:00 a.m. The shop was silent except for the low hum of the halogen bulbs. I picked up my torque wrench to bolt the cylinder head back onto the aluminum block. It was a delicate process. You tighten the bolts in a specific sequence, bringing the pressure up in stages. The aluminum from 1964 is soft, temperamental. It requires respect. I set the wrench to the first torque spec and began the sequence. A satisfying click echoed against the hood. I moved to the next bolt. The rhythm should have been soothing. It should have been muscle memory. But my vision blurred. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, thick and heavy. I blinked hard, shaking my head to clear the fog. I moved to the center stud. I adjusted the dial on the torque wrench for the final pass. The metal handle felt cold and slick with sweat. I leaned over the fender, applying steady pressure. I waited for the mechanical click that told me to stop. It didn't come. My mind slipped for a fraction of a second. I leaned into the wrench with my shoulder pushing past the resistance of the metal. I was operating on fumes and blind momentum. Then, I heard it. A sharp metallic ping. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a small dry sound like a piece of ice dropping into an empty glass. My breath caught in my throat. My hands froze on the wrench. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It pressed against my eardrums. I pulled the wrench away slowly. I leaned closer to the engine block, bringing the halogen light down. My eyes traced the smooth cast aluminum near the center head stud. There it was, a jagged hairline fracture branching out from the threaded hole. It snaked down the side of the water jacket, a black vein in the pristine metal. It was a death sentence for the engine. I dropped the wrench. It clattered against the concrete floor, a harsh noise that made me flinch. I stepped back from the car, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air in the shop felt thin. You cannot weld a crack like that on a block this old and expect it to hold. You cannot patch it. The original matching numbers engine was ruined. A replacement, if one even existed, would cost tens of thousands. The car itself was $1 million machine. Its value was tied to that specific piece of cast aluminum I had just fractured. In one careless, exhausted motion, I had wiped out the car's provenance. I slumped against the dirty cinder block wall. I slid down until I hit the cold floor. I pulled my knees to my chest and buried my face in my grease-stained hands. The smell of oil made me nauseous. I had taken the job to save my shop, to save my daughter's home. Instead, I had dug a grave so deep I would never climb out. The $5,000 in my desk drawer felt like a cruel joke. I owed a debt I couldn't comprehend. I sat there in the dirt as the hours ticked by. I didn't move. I didn't think about fixing it. There was no fixing this. There was only the brutal reality of the morning waiting for me. When the gray light of dawn crept through the windows, it illuminated the silver hood of the Aston Martin. It looked like a tombstone. I stood up, my joints stiff and aching. I walked to the office and looked at Maya. She was still sleeping, her small chest rising and falling. I had failed her. I turned away and looked back at the ruined masterpiece in the center bay. I had a choice to make. I could run. I could take the cash pack, the truck, and disappear before the transport broker came back. It was the coward's way out, but it was a way out. I walked over to the workbench and picked up the transport manifest. The owner's name was printed at the top. Arthur Vance, Vance Industries. The address was a corporate skyscraper downtown. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. A man owns his mistakes, even the ones that destroy him. I dropped Maya off at her elementary school at 8. I watched her small backpack bounce against her shoulders until she disappeared through the heavy double doors. I sat in my rusted-out Ford for a long time, listening to the heater fan rattle against the dashboard. I had scrubbed my hands with pumice soap 3 times that morning. The grease still lived deep in the creases of my knuckles. I put on my only clean canvas jacket, the collar frayed from years of wear. It smelled of old oil and cheap laundry detergent. Downtown was a different world. The buildings stretched up like glass teeth chewing on the gray morning sky. I parked my truck 3 blocks away from Vance Industries, feeding a handful of quarters into a rusted meter. I walked the rest of the way, the cold wind biting at my face. The Vance building was a monolith of black steel and tinted glass. It looked like a fortress built to keep men like me out. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, stepping from the gritty street into a climate-controlled vacuum. The air inside smelled like ozone and expensive cologne. My work boots left dull scuffs on the polished white marble floor. Men and women in tailored wool suits moved past me like schools of silver fish. None of them made eye contact. I was a ghost haunting a world I didn't belong to. I walked up to the reception desk. It was a slab of raw granite that cost more than my shop. The woman behind it didn't look up from her monitor right away. When she did, her smile was practiced, polite, and empty. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Her eyes flicked down to the faint oil stain on my jeans. "I need to see Arthur Vance," I said. My voice sounded rough, scraping against the quiet hum of the lobby. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her fingers hovering over a sleek keyboard. "No, but tell him the mechanic handling his DB5 is here." I kept my voice low, steady. Tell him it's an emergency. She hesitated, weighing the risk of turning me away against the risk of bothering her boss. She picked up a phone and spoke in hushed tones. A minute later, a man in a dark suit appeared and motioned for me to follow him. We walked to a bank of private elevators. The doors slid shut, sealing us in a box of brushed steel and silence. The elevator shot upward, leaving my stomach somewhere around the 5th floor. We stepped out onto the top floor, onto carpet so thick it swallowed the sound of my heavy boots. The security man pointed to a set of double oak doors at the end of the hall. I walked alone. Every step felt like walking toward a firing squad. I pushed the doors open and stepped into an office the size of my entire garage. 2 walls were nothing but floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a bird's-eye view of the city I was drowning in. Behind a massive walnut desk sat Arthur Vance. He didn't look up when I entered. He was signing papers, his silver pen moving with sharp, aggressive strokes. He was an older man, his hair slate gray, his suit immaculate and sharp enough to cut glass. "You have 2 minutes, Vance said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. Explain the emergency. I walked closer, stopping a few feet from his desk. I didn't take off my jacket. I didn't try to shrink myself to fit the room. I stood tall, planting my boots on his expensive rug. "You're Aston Martin?" I started, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "The transport brought it in yesterday. I diagnosed the misfire, burnt exhaust valve on cylinder 4. Vance stopped writing. He looked up, his eyes a cold, piercing blue. They were the eyes of a man who dissected problems and destroyed them. He didn't say a word, waiting for the rest. "I pulled the head last night," I continued. "I did the valve job. But when I was torquing the head back down to the block, I made a mistake." And I held his gaze. I didn't blink. A man owns his failures even when they break him. I was exhausted. I pushed past the torque spec. I cracked the engine block near the center stud. The silence in the room became a physical pressure. It pressed against my eardrums, tight and suffocating. Vance laid his pen down. The soft click echoed like a gunshot. He leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He studied me. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. The quiet was worse. It was the calculated silence of a predator figuring out where to sink its teeth. I waited for the execution. "Do you know what that car is?" Vance asked. His tone was dangerously level. "It is a matching numbers vehicle. It took me 4 years to track it down. You didn't just break a piece of metal." "I know," I said. "I destroyed the provenance. I ruined the value of the engine." "You ruined a piece of history," he corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "Because you were careless. Because I was trying to keep the bank from taking my shop," I said. The truth slipped out before I could stop it. I didn't want his pity. I just wanted the facts on the table. Vance's expression didn't change. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the crawling traffic far below. He stood there for a long time. "I could ruin you for this," he said to the glass. "I could have my lawyers tie you up in court until you were penniless. I could take your shop, your tools, and whatever miserable life you've built. You can try," I said softly, "but the bank will beat you to it in 30 days. There's nothing left to take." He turned around, his eyes narrowing. He looked at my worn boots, my grease-stained hands, the tired slump of my shoulders. He was doing the math on my life. I was a bad investment. $5,000, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket. I pulled out the thick envelope the transport broker had given me. I tossed it onto his immaculate walnut desk. "It's the deposit. It's all I have." Vance looked at the dirty envelope sitting on his clean desk. He didn't touch it. A strange, hard look crossed his face. "Keep your money," Vance said. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. "Cash won't fix my block. And lawyers take too much time." I stood frozen. I didn't understand the game he was playing. Men like him didn't just walk away from a lost $1 million. They exacted a toll. "Then what do you want?" I asked, bracing myself for the impact. Vance walked back to his desk and leaned over it, resting his knuckles on the wood. He looked right through me. "I want your sweat," he said. Vance gave me an address on a slip of heavy cardstock. It wasn't a corporate building. It was an estate 50 miles outside the city limits, hidden behind wrought iron gates and old-growth pines. The terms were simple. He had a private collection of machines that needed a ghost to bring them back to life. Tractors, pre-war motorcycles, engines left to rot by time. I was to be that ghost. I would work off the dead of the ruined block. My labor belonged to him until he decided we were square. I drove up to the estate 2 days later. The iron gates parted without a sound. The driveway was a ribbon of black asphalt winding through acres of silent manicured lawn. His garage was larger than my entire property lot. The floor was coated in white epoxy that mirrored the fluorescent tubes above. It looked like a surgical theater. There was no dirt, no stray bolts, no history baked into the walls. In the center sat the silver Aston Martin. The hood was up, a monument to my failure. Vance walked in a few minutes later. He wore a heavy wool sweater and dark slacks. He didn't offer a greeting, just handed me a clipboard. It held a list of tasks that would have taken a team of men a month to finish. "Start with the 1930 Indian Scout," he said, pointing to a rusted motorcycle in the corner. "It's seized 30 years ago. Tear it down." I nodded. I set my toolbox on the pristine floor. The dented red steel looked like an open wound against the white epoxy. The work began. It was a punishing rhythm. I ran my shop during the daylight hours, fighting for scraps, fighting the bank's final notices. When the sun went down, I locked my doors and drove the 50 miles to Vance's estate. My days bled into a blur of highway lines and engine grease. My hands split open from the cold and the constant use. I taped my knuckles with black electrical tape just to keep a grip on the heavy wrenches. Maya sat in the corner of the massive garage on the weekends. I set up a small folding table for her coloring books. She wrapped herself in my old canvas jacket to fight the draft. She was quiet, watching me dismantle history piece by piece. She never complained. Her silence hurt more than the ache in my joints. Vance was always there. He didn't help. He sat in a leather armchair near a wall of untouched tools, nursing a glass of dark amber liquid. He watched me work. It was a heavy, suffocating scrutiny. He was a man used to breaking things and buying new ones. He was waiting for me to quit. He wanted to see when my spine would snap under the weight of the debt and the exhaustion. I refused to give him the satisfaction. The Indian Scout was a stubborn mess of rusted bolts and fused metal. I soaked the cylinder head in penetrating oil for 2 nights. I used a brass hammer to coax the pistons loose. Every strike of the hammer echoed in the cavernous room. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of a man paying for his sins in sweat. My lower back burned with a constant dull fire. I ignored it. I wiped the sweat from my brow with a dirty rag. I left a smear of black grease across my forehead. I could feel Vance's cold blue eyes tracking my every movement. "You use too much force," Vance said one night from his chair. The ice clinked in his glass. "That metal is brittle. You lack finesse." I stopped hammering. I set the brass mallet down on the steel workbench. My chest heaved with exertion. The air in the garage was cold, but my shirt clung to my skin. "It's seized, Mr. Vance," I said. My voice was rough, thick with fatigue. Time fused the rings to the cylinder wall. You can't ask it politely to let go. You have to break the bond. He took a slow sip of his drink. He didn't argue. He just watched the veins cord in my forearms as I picked the hammer back up. The physical toll was brutal. The mental weight was worse. I was a man who took pride in ownership. I owned my tools, my shop, my mistakes. Now a billionaire owned my time. I was missing Maya's bedtimes. I was missing the quiet moments we used to share over burnt toast in the mornings. The bank called my cell phone twice a day. I let it ring. One Friday night around midnight, a bolt sheared off flush with the engine case. It was a rookie mistake born of pure exhaustion. My hands were shaking from too much stale coffee and too little sleep. I stared at the broken stud. Defeat tasted like copper in the back of my mouth. I dropped the wrench. It hit the white epoxy floor with a sharp crack. The noise bounced off the pristine walls. Vance stood up. He walked over slowly, his leather shoes silent on the floor. He looked at the sheared bolt. Then he looked at my face. The lines around his eyes deepened. He saw the bags under my eyes, the tape on my fingers. He didn't yell. He didn't berate me for the mistake. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver center punch. He handed it to me. "Drill it out," Vance said. His voice was a low rumble. "Start over. Staring at it won't extract the metal." He turned and walked back to his chair. He didn't see a father drowning in debt. He just saw the machine and the labor required to fix it. I took a ragged breath. I picked up the heavy drill. The bit bit into the broken steel, sending a spiral of metal shavings onto the pristine floor. I wasn't a man anymore. I was an extension of the tools. I was a gear in Vance's world, grinding down until there was nothing left. But the drill kept spinning. I pushed my weight into the metal. The friction created a plume of thin gray smoke. I would not stop. I would bore through the steel, through the exhaustion, through the shame. I would pay the toll. The grandfather clock in the corner of his garage chimed 2 in the morning. Maya shifted in her sleep on the folding chair. I kept drilling. Weeks bled into a cold, unforgiving December. The bank sent their final notice, a piece of certified mail I left unopened on my shop's workbench. Here in Vance's immaculate garage, time was measured in torque and tension. It was past midnight on a Tuesday. The wind howled against the reinforced glass windows, a bitter reminder of the winter outside. The Indian Scout engine sat on the bench, stripped down to its bare iron bones. I wiped the heavy black grease from a piston ring. I ran my thumbnail along the edge, feeling for the microscopic grooves that told the story of its wear. Vance was in his usual spot, the leather chair in the shadows. He had a fresh glass of scotch in his hand. The amber liquid caught the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sharp, impatient sound. "You fight a losing battle, mechanic," Vance said. The vast silence of the room swallowed the sound of his voice. "Your shop is dead. This debt is endless." I didn't look up from the iron ring in my hands. A machine isn't dead until you stop turning the wrenches. My shop is still standing. Vance let out a dry, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Pride is a heavy anchor. It will drag you and that little girl straight to the bottom. I set the piston down on the steel bench. The clink of metal against metal was a sharp retort. I turned to face him, wiping my bruised hands on a red shop rag. "It's not pride," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's responsibility. You don't throw away a foundation just because the roof is leaking." Vance stood up. He walked over to the workbench, his expensive leather shoes silent against the white, epoxy floor. He looked down at the scattered, rust-stained parts of the old motorcycle engine. "It's scrap," Vance said, pointing a manicured finger at the pitted cylinder. "The metal is fatigued. The tolerances are gone. It makes no economic sense to rebuild a failure." "Not everything is a spreadsheet, Mr. Vance," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. "Some things have value because of the miles they've survived. They have a history that matters." He scoffed, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. "History is just a record of failures. When a component fails in my company, I replace it. I don't waste time trying to teach broken steel how to bear weight again." I looked closely at the older man. Beneath the sharp, tailored suit and the cold, unblinking eyes, there was a rigid, unyielding posture. He was a man built entirely of sharp angles and closed doors. "That's the difference between us," I said. "You look at a crack and see a reason to discard the machine. I look at it and see a place where the metal needs a weld." I picked up the scarred piston again. I ran my thumb over the thick carbon buildup baked onto the crown. Steel doesn't fail overnight. It suffers stress fractures. I held the part up to the harsh light. Tiny, invisible breaks that happen over years of neglect and pressure. You can't see them until it's too late. Vance stared at the piston in my hand. He didn't say a word. The ice in his glass shifted with another soft, hollow click. "If you catch them early, you can fix them," I continued. "You apply heat. You fill the void with new material. You make the bond stronger than the original cast." "And if you don't?" Vance asked. His voice had lost its usual sharp, commanding edge. It was quieter, almost distant. "If you ignore the stress, the block shatters," I said, holding his gaze without flinching. "Just like the Aston Martin. One day you put a little too much pressure on it, and the whole thing comes apart." I set the piston down. "And you can't put the pieces back together the way they were." Vance looked away. He stared past me, fixing his eyes on the silver hood of the ruined car sitting dead in the center bay. The lines around his mouth tightened into a hard grimace. I had spent enough time around broken, desperate men to recognize the signs. The stoic mask, the deliberate isolation, the constant need to control everything in the room. Vance wasn't talking about engines anymore. "My son hasn't spoken to me in 5 years, Vance said to the empty, echoing garage. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. He made a mistake. A big one in the firm. I stayed quiet. A man needs silence to dig out a buried truth. I picked up a coarse shop towel and scrubbed the dirt from a heavy valve spring. I did what I always do. Vance continued, his voice tight with an unseen strain. I cut the liability. I pushed him out. I told myself it was business, that the structure of the company had to survive above all else. He looked down at his glass. The amber liquid trembled, betraying the slight shake in his hand. I threw away the foundation because the roof was leaking. We stood there in the harsh clinical light, a grease-stained, indebted mechanic and a billionaire CEO, separated by a steel workbench and a lifetime of different choices. The air between us shifted, growing dense. "You can't buy a replacement part for a family, Mr. Vance," I said, softly breaking the heavy quiet. "There's no catalog for that. You have to get your hands dirty and do the actual repair." Vance looked at me. The cold, impenetrable ice in his eyes had fractured. He looked like a man who had just realized the massive empire he built was entirely empty. "How do you weld a bridge that's been burned to ash?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge or a corporate test. It was a genuine, desperate plea from a man drowning in his own choices. "You don't weld ash," I said, picking up a heavy Torque wrench. "You forge new steel. You take the first step, and you own the damage you caused." I turned back to the Indian Scout engine. I coated the cylinder wall with fresh oil. I slid the piston into the chamber, feeling the tight, satisfying resistance of the new rings seating against the iron. "You swallow the pride," I said over my shoulder, my voice a steady rumble in the quiet. "You pick up the phone, and you start turning the wrench, even if it hurts your hands." Vance stood in silence for a long time. The only sound was the scrape of my tools against the unyielding metal. Then I heard the faint, crisp rustle of his wool suit. He set his glass down on the polished edge of the workbench. He turned and walked away. The heavy oak door to his house clicked shut, leaving me alone with the sleeping child and the quiet machines. I didn't know if the old man would make the call. That wasn't my job to fix. My job was to rebuild the broken things left in my care, one bolt at a time. I wiped the sweat from my face with my frayed sleeve. The night was still deep, but the crushing ache in my chest had lessened. I picked up a socket and went back to the grind. The winter broke on a Tuesday morning. The frost on the garage windows began to weep, running down the glass in long, clear lines. I stood over the Indian Scout holding a stained shop rag. The engine was a solid block of iron and purpose once again. The rusted C's shell I had started with was gone. In its place was a machine ready to breathe. I checked the new fuel line. I primed the carburetor with a heavy thumb, watching the amber liquid fill the clear filter. The smell of raw gasoline cut through the sterile air of the epoxy-coated room. Vance walked in just as I placed my boot on the kickstarter. He wasn't wearing his usual armor. The sharp, tailored suit was gone, replaced by a worn flannel shirt and heavy denim. He looked older, but the rigid tension in his shoulders had softened. He stopped a few feet away, his hands resting deep in his pockets. We didn't exchange words. I threw my weight down on the heavy steel lever. The gears engaged with a harsh metallic bite. The engine coughed a dry sputter of air and fuel and died. I reset the lever. I found top dead center, feeling the compression build against the thick sole of my boot. I kicked it again, harder this time, putting the last of my aching strength into the downward thrust. The exhaust cracked like a rifle shot. A plume of blue smoke shot out of the straight tailpipe. Then it settled into a low, rhythmic idle. It was a heartbeat of fire and iron. The sound filled the cavernous space, vibrating against the pristine walls. I rested my grease-stained hands on the leather saddle, feeling the steady pulse of the machine. Vance walked closer. He didn't look at the motorcycle. He looked at my hands, studying the raw knuckles and the black dirt permanently etched into my skin. "It sounds steady," Vance said, raising his voice over the mechanical roar. He reached out and placed a hand on the cold steel of the fuel tank. He felt the vibration travel up his arm. "It just needed someone to put the work in," I said. I reached down and cut the ignition. The engine choked out, leaving a heavy ringing silence in its wake. Vance nodded slowly. He stood there for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the polished paint of the old gas tank. He pulled a folded piece of heavy stock paper from his shirt pocket. He handed it to me. "I made the call," he said. His voice was rough like gravel under a heavy tire. "It took 3 tries before he picked up. I took the paper, wiping my hands on my jeans first. And, "We are meeting for coffee tomorrow. Just coffee. It's a start." He looked past me, staring at the silver Aston Martin still sitting dead in the center bay. "You don't weld ash. You forge new steel." I unfolded the paper in my hands. It wasn't a list of new tasks. It wasn't a bill for the ruined engine block. It was a letterhead from my bank. It was the deed to my shop. Stamped across the front in thick red ink was a single word: satisfied. I stared at the letters. The air in my lungs felt suddenly light. The crushing weight that had sat on my chest for 8 months evaporated into the smell of exhaust and old oil. "The debt was for the engine block," I said, my voice tight. "This is worth 10 times that amount. I can't accept this." "The debt is paid," Vance said, meeting my eyes with a level gaze. "You gave me back my son. I am giving you back your foundation." He reached out and offered his hand. It wasn't the calculated handshake of a CEO closing a hostile merger. It was the firm, grounded grip of one man acknowledging another. I took it. His palm was softer than mine, but the grip was strong. We were square. I packed my red steel toolbox an hour later. Maya was awake, rubbing the sleep from her eyes on the folding chair. I wrapped her in my heavy canvas jacket and carried her out to the rusted Ford. The drive back to the city felt different. The heater still rattled and the suspension still groaned over every pothole, but the road ahead didn't look like a dead end anymore. We pulled up to the shop just as the sun broke over the low-income apartments. The corrugated tin roof caught the weak morning light. The bay doors were closed, but they were mine to open. I carried Maya inside and set her down on the worn waiting room sofa. I walked over to the workbench and swept the stack of final notices into the trash. I picked up a 3/4 wrench. The steel felt familiar. It felt right. A man measures his worth by what he can provide, and by the things he refuses to let stay broken. We all carry fractured pieces inside us. We all have engines that have seized under the pressure of the years, rusted tight by pride or fear. The world will tell you to throw them away, to cut your losses and walk away from the damage. But the real value isn't found in a pristine, untouched life. It is found in the repair. It is found in the willingness to get your hands dirty, to confront the broken metal, and to put the pieces back together stronger than before. Take a look at your own life today. Think about the things you have let gather dust, the relationships you have let rust, or the foundations you have allowed to crack under the strain. If you have a machine that needs fixing or a bridge you need to rebuild, leave your story in the comments below, and let's turn the wrenches together.